Good morning, everyone. As we prepare to celebrate the 157th anniversary of Juneteenth, I can't help but think of the words of the late, great James Baldwin, who wrote, "History is not merely something to be read. It does not merely refer to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. It is to history that we owe our frame of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. But as Baldwin knew all too well, when history is made, it can be slow sometimes to reach some parts of humanity. It wasn't until June 19th, 1865, more than 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and 2 months after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered, that the last enslaved people in Texas learned that they were free. So again, good morning and welcome. I'm Caddy Cesare, Vice President of Global HR and Talent Development here at the Atlantic Council. And it's my honor to welcome all of you today to today's event hosted by the Atlantic Council's Black Employee Network, Juneteenth, celebrating our past, present, and future. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this very special conversation as we commemorate a day that marked the end of slavery in the United States. This event will celebrate and discuss the legacy of Juneteenth and its impact on the past, present, and future of the American and global political landscape. We'll be featuring a panel of unique perspectives from Black and African American individuals in the foreign policy, government, and political spheres. As June 19th continues to be a day of joy and celebration, and of course, we can't forget how we like to celebrate with food, good food at that, and music too. So this weekend, you should be out to celebrate. We now even have more reasons to celebrate. Last year, both chambers of Congress passed the legislation making Juneteenth a federal holiday. And this morning, we'll be exploring the triumph of Black life and culture and its reflection on those whose shoulders we stand on through the perspectives of Black and African American individuals in the public and political sectors. As the conversation surrounding racial injustice and Black liberation grows in complexity, the Council recognizes its importance that Juneteenth holds in amplifying Black voices. This discussion today aims to further center the Black experience on the political stage and further strengthen our efforts towards the goals and international unity in the face of adversity. Our conversation this morning will be moderated by Ambassador Ramayad, our Senior Director of the Council's Africa Center, my apologies. Prior to joining the Council, Ambassador Yad consulted for the World Bank, advising the institution on education, youth sports, human capital, and disability issues in Africa. Ambassador Yad has over a decade of experience working in French, European, and international politics. And at the age of 30, she was appointed as Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Human Rights of the Republic of France. She's the first ever French Minister of Human Rights and the first woman of African descent to become a member of the French cabinet. It's an honor to have her here with us today to moderate this dialogue. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to her to introduce our panel and to get our conversation going. Ambassador Yad, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kadi, for this very inspiring opening speech and your kind words to me. Thank you very much. Today we honor Juneteenth. Thank you, Atlantic Council's Black Employee Network and its co-chairs, Kiana Cunningham, Maya Edwards, and Devin Johnson for launching this first Juneteenth at the Council. To discuss the legacy of Juneteenth and its impact on global political landscape, we have invited a panel of unique perspectives from Black and African American individuals in the foreign policy, government, and political fields. Among them, our three guests. General Stewart. General, you serve as a senior foreign policy advisor to the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. In this capacity, you provide advisory counsel to the White House, National Security Council, and US Congress concerning national security policies related to irregular warfare, counterterrorism, too. And we host today Dr. Lewis, Juanita Lewis. Dr. Lewis, you are the CEO and co-founder Crescendo Foods, Ghana's first culinary incubator in Accra, in Ghana. Previously, you served as a senior economic program advisor in the U.S. Department of State's office on global women's issues and the Foreign Affairs Officer Fellow in the Office of Agricultural Policy. And our next guest is Lewis H. Myers. Mr. Myers, you have served in Congress during 10 years for powerful Congressional Black Caucus members. You helped advise Congresswoman Fudge during her time as CBC chair in the 2016 Democratic National Convention. You then transitioned to Congresswoman Plaskett's office and currently serve as senior advisor for Congressman Tony Cardenas, representing California's 29th district. So welcome. My first question, because it's time to start now, my first question is for all of you. And very simple, what does Juneteenth mean to you? What does celebrating Juneteenth symbolize? Is it for you an act of resistance or a show of strength or both? Please, any of you, maybe women first or Mr. Myers? I don't know, as you want.
Ms. Lewis, if you'd like to go first.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you all for having me. I would like to say, for me, what Juneteenth means to me is that it's a holiday that celebrates our culture and our liberation, although, we are not free. We can say that we're free, but I always put it in quotations. And for me, when I think about the holiday, it symbolizes both. It is an act of resistance, but also a show of strength. And the reason why is that it's both is because when we think about resistance, we have refused in a great way to let society tell our stories to the next generation, even the current generation. And it also is a sign of strength, and it symbolizes the continual fight for our people to take up space in the world that we are not allowed to fully do so. So that is what Juneteenth means to me. And it also allows us to be able to show up in this world of what feels best for us, and not to look at what we say Blackness is defined as one thing, but it's a very diverse, it celebrates the diversity of our culture.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. Mr. Myers.
Along those lines as well, being on Capitol Hill, I think it's also an opportunity for education. There are a lot of African Americans who weren't aware of Juneteenth. And so for it to be a federal holiday is an opportunity for the nation to understand what Juneteenth is, and for us to really embrace many of the things that we're still facing today that you see in the news. And so we need more platforms and opportunities like this to promote what Juneteenth is and how we can grow as a nation. And I'd also like to thank everyone for the invite today and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. I think Gennaro Stewart has maybe the same congressional point of view, right?
Yeah, definitely agree with the other panelists. I think if I look at it from a different angle, really the symbolic nature of it, being in 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, then years later was Juneteenth. It really shows that the African-American struggle is something that continues, that we have made progress, but there's still area to go. That even during 1863, all African-Americans and enslaved individuals were not free. So it shows we continue down this road of really trying to find that happy medium, or really to the point in which really that equality really exists. So that's the symbology of how I see Juneteenth.
Thank you very much. Now, maybe we can tackle the tough issues. Juneteenth is a moment of honoring the past, of course, recognizing the struggles of the present, like you said, and calling on progress for the future. Now, what do you believe are our biggest hurdles to Black liberation in policy today? What are the challenges? As civil servants, what responsibility do we have to combat those struggles. Do you see yourselves as a role model in this, Dr. Lewis?
I would definitely say yes. I do definitely see myself in that struggle, right? Even though I currently live in West Africa, you still see, policy affects everyone, whether you're an American in America or you're American living in another culture. One of the biggest hurdles that I always see is that there's this need to only have one side of Black voices be represented. And you see that in all contexts. And I'm sure, Ambassador, you probably have stories yourself. So for what I see is that we love to compartmentalize our liberation and make it non-exclusive, which is a problem, right? So for example, liberation may mean that it's only seen for Black men and maybe sometimes Black women who identify as cisgender, their level of education, their economic status, and the list goes on and on. But we as a people, we're much more than that, right? Blackness is not defined as one thing, it's intersectional. And in order for us to have Black liberation, we have to keep this in mind when we're making up these policies. And until we have policies that represent all people and all these intersections, no matter what you define yourself as, we will still be continuing to fight the same fight. And so for me, my responsibility is to make sure that everyone is included. I mean, my background's in agriculture, but a lot of the time it's, looking at, yes, there's women in STEM, and yes, that is a fight that still needs to continue. But also looking at it from a broader scheme of things is that there aren't a lot of Black people in, let's say, agriculture who are in food science. So making sure that all these voices are included in order for us to be able to, have Black liberation actually come to be, but also we have to include that in our policies and that when we make it.
Thank you. Do you remember this poem, The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman, when the young poet stressed this unfinished nation? And here in Washington, D.C., a historically predominantly Black city, the holiday is widely observed and recognized as a momentous celebration of Black liberation. We, however, can help to realize this observance is not shared by the nation, the unfinished nation. So in your opinion, does this seem like a realistic goal to continue to recognize, to try to recognize what is now a federal holiday by local governments? Should we be realistic, or should we remain idealistic? What do you think? These slow movements, General Stewart, your opinion, please.
I know Dr. King used to always say that time is a benefit to your enemy oftentimes. So I think we have to continue to be very intentional really about that progress and what we define as that progress. I also think to Dr. Lewis's point, that something that was the underlining view of a lot of things she said was really education. And I think we need to educate, people within the country and African Americans and other groups, but just I think education in general. We continue to move down this road, and I know when we talk about subjects of critical race, at the end of the day, history as we define it, Black history, African American history, is American history, and it can't be something viewed as something completely separate, but truly has to understand that America has to really get to a point in which we really accept our good and our faults. America, is that shining light, but also America has a lot of dark spots in that history. And I think the only way you're going to move past it is to really own it and accept it and move through it. Change is not going to happen by really trying to distract it. Actually makes it continue to linger on. So I think we've got to be intentional as Americans, as the world, to really just accept the good and the bad of our own individual history. That really makes us who we are.
Speaking of education, Mr. Myers, what role do you believe education plays or should play in the framing of Juneteenth? As many states grapple over the question of critical race theory being taught and recognized by educational institutions, is now the time to cement this into standardized teaching, or is there a political framework that should be followed? For example, waiting for certain election cycle, voter outcomes, Mr. Myers?
Education is a huge role. I think it could be taught at a further extent within our school systems. And I just want to hop back on the policy point. In a divided Congress, at times it can be difficult to get meaningful common sense legislation passed. What we do need to see is great activity that we've seen from organizations like the Congressional Black Caucus. Another way to inform policy is to have African Americans as chairs of committees who draft legislation. And so there's really a groundswell that needs to happen from a political standpoint when it comes to African Americans and our impact. There's also a need for more diversity in African Americans on Capitol Hill. The numbers are not a reflection of the country. And I think if you want meaningful legislation, you have to have people who are constituents from around the country who can actually have a firsthand view. On top of that, I think the critical race theory conversation is an interesting one. And I think it's more of a talking point that riles up certain individuals. I think that there should be a comprehensive task force, and it could start with the Education and Labor Committee to more incentivize what it should take to get the accuracy of American history taught in our school systems. And education is a key point with Juneteenth. It's sad to say in some instances, there are African Americans on Capitol Hill in my 10 years who did not know about Juneteenth. And so that's a situation that should be addressed in itself. And like I said, it's opportunities like this, it's the Congressional Black Caucus and other organizations that can amplify what Juneteenth is and the education of it.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. Let's widen our vision and perspective here a few seconds. This question is for all of you, but maybe we can start with Dr. Lewis. I think everybody has read or heard about the great African-American historian Ibram X. Kendi, who explains very well that there is nothing more difficult than being anti-racist. While the racist denies is racism, the heart of anti-racism is to confess, to recognize racial inequalities, to say that if we have more as a white person, it is not only because we are more or because we have been able to work hard, but because society has given us opportunities that others did not have, and then struggle against this gap. It's a difficult path for many people. That is why, yes, there is nothing harder than being anti-racist. So my question is, what actions, Dr. Lewis, what actions are white folks responsible for in dismantling racism and white supremacies in our communities?
Sure. I mean, I think that's always a loaded question. So I'm interested to know what the other panelists will say. One, we could always say hold themselves accountable and to understand, and read all the books. But I think also too, it's really a reprogramming. Because if you think about it, white people more so look at themselves as individuals as opposed to we're generalized. There's a lot of generalizations. And so the thing is, it's a mindset. And understanding that, like you said, nothing's being taken away from you. It's more so about sharing the access, but also understanding that, even if you are someone who is in a lower socioeconomic class, and on top of that, you are, you're a white person, you probably will not have access to some of the things that we may not be able to have access either. And so it really is, as Lewis commented and stated that, we have the 1619 Project. It's not just for only Black people to understand the history, but also for white people to understand too. So it should not be our job to continue to educate, but they'll have to take the responsibility of holding themselves accountable, holding other people in their spaces accountable instead of just saying, oh, it's just my crazy uncle, but also being able to think more, past just generalizing a group of people.
Thank you very much. Mr. Myers, would you like to add something? Or General Stewart, maybe?
To the earlier point, the crux of it is if you don't address the issue, then how can you solve it? And there has to be some hard conversations, not only from politicians and lawmakers, but from governors, mayors. There needs to be a comprehensive, some would argue, conversation nationally to address the circumstances that we're talking about today. It's hard to heal a cancer if you don't know or been diagnosed. And so we really have to have those conversations. And are people willing to have those conversations? There are a few, but we need more amplification, as said before, to get going on this. We got the federal holiday last year. I think that's a huge step. But what more can we add to that now to continue the momentum? Because if you think about it, it took this long to get a bill passed. And now we just want to let it sit. No, we need to continue to do more. I invite all individuals who are passionate about it to come visit Capitol Hill if they can. Come talk to your representatives. There's also a constituency side of things that really pushes the needle. And so if you can't make it to DC, write letters, call offices. That's a form of amplification that's larger than the lawmakers' voices. And so I think there's a multitude of opportunities that we can continue to educate and speak on the good news, which is June 16th. Juneteenth.
Thank you very much, Lewis. Maybe General Stewart, about the role of Congress people, staffers, advisors. What do you think?
I'm not on Congress. I'm not on Capitol Hill, so I would have to pass that to Mr. Lewis. I would hate to kind of speak out of turn based on my experience. But yeah. To the overall point, I definitely agree to all the other panelists. I think oftentimes that, when it comes to interacting with marginalized groups, there's always this level of uncomfortability. But uncomfortability is okay. That's how you're stretched. That's how you really grow. And I hear people say oftentimes that groups don't always need allies. They also need accomplices. So you also need to be open to utilizing that privilege that truly does exist to really open up doors and make sure that organizations and governments are reflective truly of the people, that we're all here together. We all need to figure out how to make this thing work together. So I think when we look at executive boards and organizations, they should truly reflect your workforce. That's how you can be intentional about really making it work.
Yes, white folks, African folks too. Let me talk about how Africa could play a role in this story for the future. As mentioned by Kadi at the very start of this meeting, I'm running right now the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. So from just a few words from an African point of view, personally, I grew up in Dakar on the island of Gorée, where which saw so many of our ancestors were abducted to be brought in America. The Atlantic Ocean that feeds Senegalese families right now with its national fish has been their graveyard before. And everything on the coast of the Almadi, where I live, when I come to Dakar, bears that stigma of the trade. On the family tree of my family, my great-grandparents recorded the names of the people who disappeared. Africa has never forgotten the children it has lost. And I think it's important to say that. And on the geopolitical side, there is no America without the African slaves and their children and their grandchildren. And as a child who grew up in France, as immigrants, we dreamt of the current successes of African Americans, which means that how much this community is resilient, from Hollywood to the NBA. But from Alex Haley to the African American Museum and the Civil Rights Movement, we have been shocked by the struggles that have been necessary and still are. So Dr. Lewis, can we start with you on this, since you are in Accra? How can Africans be included in this fight? And even the other African diasporas in the Caribbean area, in Europe, in Asia, because Africa is not only in Africa.
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing is what I've learned from being here and just traveling throughout the continent is that when we think about colonialism, we don't realize how colonialism has affected everyone, to your point, Ambassador. We hear about the African-American struggle, which yes, should be talked about, but we also don't hear about the African struggle. What has happened after these nations receive their independence? How foreign aid comes into play, how colorism, is being utilized to be able to segregate certain families. And yes, granted, yes, there is other issues that are, or should say challenges that Africans face when it comes to tribalism, and all of that. But, to an extent, all that has been exacerbated because of colonialism. And so I think the thing is that there's a conversation that people have. I know that, just being here, some Ghanaians may not understand racism until they move to the US, and then they move to a space where, and more so, I would say the US, where they actually encounter racism, right? And then it's like, oh, okay, it clicks. And I think, how we can bring in Africans in the conversation is that we need to be able to understand both. Both of these things exist. While we were going, fighting for civil rights, trying to get this, amendments passed, trying to get the civil rights bill to happen. At the same time, you have Ghana that just received its independence in 1957. You have, what's going on in Asia as well. You have Vietnam also trying to do that. So a lot of these things is that to be able to bring Africans into it is that we need to really have a table to just be able to talk about the history of what we can find from both, right? I think both parties are kind of, I wouldn't say envious, but, have this interesting vision of what they think the other person's struggle is. And until we have those conversations, even reading Kwame Nkrumah's book, understanding that a lot of the African leaders went to HBCUs, right? They were HBCUs, they were part of Black fraternity organizations. A lot of people don't know that. And even for me coming here in this space, I've learned so much. And that's because sometimes I just need to be quiet. I don't need to say anything, right? Sometimes I just need to listen. And I've learned so much. So I think if we have really an opportunity to just talk about the history of both, I won't say struggles, but both experiences, what has happened to enslaved Africans when they've come to the US or to the Caribbean or to South America, to what happened afterwards. What happened to the people that were left behind? And I wouldn't even say left behind in that, to make it negative, but the people who were there that stayed. So to me, I feel like that's how Africans can be brought into the conversation, but also being able to validate everyone's experience as well, instead of saying your experience is worse than mine, because we're not solving anything.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I think this question is large enough to ask our other friends what their opinion is. Mr. Myers, can the inclusion of Africans from Africa today, could it help for the fight here in the United States?
It wouldn't hurt. And so you have to do whatever type of outreach you can. I love kind of the story of the Clotilda, which many are familiar with, which was the last recognized slave ship. The way they were able to kind of reconstruct that in Africa Town, which still exists today, the way we're able to kind of go back and kind of reconstruct the beginning, because there's so many lost souls whose stories will never be told. And I think that's all part of the nexus of what we're talking about here. To another point about highlighting Juneteenth, I really think an organization should work with maybe Sheila Jackson Lee's office and create what we would call on Capitol Hill a Juneteenth fly-in, where you organize individuals from around the country to fly to DC for the sole purpose of further amplifying the Juneteenth initiative. But yes, I think there's a critical part. We also do what we call codels, which are opportunities for members of Congress to travel abroad to learn and be educated. And that might be another opportunity as well, is to get the CBC to look at initiating a Africa codel where they can put a few more of the dots together.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. General Stewart, how do you imagine, how do you see an African involvement as a continent in this struggle?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the other panelists. I think there is definitely a lot of relatability in that space. I know the first time I ever had an opportunity to live and travel to places like Uganda throughout East Africa, it really was an immersion of education. It really dispelled a lot of ignorance that just exists, just because being so far away, you just don't have that true understanding of the continent. So I definitely think there's a lot of different spaces, and I'm finding that perspective and that relatability could always definitely be helpful in really trying to reimagine how to approach different problems here in the States. Absolutely.
Yeah. As you know, the struggle for Black liberation highlighted by Juneteenth is an issue that reaches farther than we can imagine. For those with multiple oppressions and intersecting identities, how does the push for Black liberation lead to the liberation of all? Still on this idea to include everybody. Dr. Lewis?
Sure. I would definitely say that we first have to not put Blackness into a box. We have to be able to understand that if it means that if there's people who are going through other, who are suffering with multiple oppressions and intersecting identities, in order for us to be able to understand that Blackness is not defined by one thing, we'll be able to have the liberation of other people, because that means that we'll be able to accept others for who they are and validating their journeys and what they've gone through. And of course, how to bring people together is food, right? I work in the food space, and that, that's something that we're doing over at Crescendo, is bringing folks across the diaspora to Ghana who are in the food space to be able to, have a safe space to talk about, what does liberation mean when it comes in terms of food culture, and then you can also open up the door to other things. And then once we have that validation and everyone understanding, or, and you may not even be understand, I should say respect. Once you respect somebody, to me, I feel like it allows you to be able to open doors, to be able to accept other people and other, oppressions and where they are, and to be able to share those lessons learned. Because the one thing is, if we're liberated and we're not sharing those lessons for others, then people won't be able to understand. And then also know the history, right? So knowing that there's a women's rights amendment that's never been passed, right? And understanding, what does that mean? It doesn't just affect you, but it affects everyone. So I think, it's just really kind of looking at it from a broader perspective and saying that, we have to, even though we'll be liberated, we also have to share that information as well in order for others who are oppressed to also be free.
Yes, freedom, democracy, to live in peace, we need to trust in democracy, to have this democratic space where the citizens, the people, can belong together. And here I would like to dive into the voter suppression challenge. Voter suppression is an increasingly large issue facing those most affected by systematic oppression. What then is the role? My question is for Mr. Myers, since he comes from the Congress. What then is the role of the voter in those districts where it may be more difficult to fight for your rights in democratic methods?
Well, we always need to register more African Americans just in general. We have a golden opportunity to really have an impact on this country in ways individuals don't even realize, but we have low voter turnout in many regards. We're having hearings right now for January 6th, which was a full-on assault to wreck the very democracy that we're trying to protect. So I think there is a role. I mean, what's happening in Georgia, for example, is outrageous. And that's why we have to Go TV is a term that we use, just get out to vote. We have to get people more mobilized in order to figure out these systemic problems. I mean, you have head secretaries of state who are now looking to intentionally overturn the vote and the will of the people. Like, that's dangerous. I mean, we are on the brink, the precipice of something that, could not be fixed. And I think it's going to take a greater opportunity for folk to get out to vote. I think that the voter suppression is a real thing. I think misinformation is just as deadly. And so we have to find ways to counteract that so that, folk are educated, folk get out to vote, because it's not just enough to be a registered voter. You then have to get out. And that includes maybe, transportation options for people who can't get to the polls. There's a multitude of things that need to go into it. But more importantly, if we had more registered African-American voters and people of color, we would win more state races, more local races, more federal races than we could ever imagine. But some people who aren't as adept in politics say, well, my vote doesn't count. What does my one vote matter? And we have to educate them to see that if you don't vote, we can have people who are pulling purse strings and policies that are going to be adverse for generations to come.
And in the country of mass incarceration of Black people, this matter of voters is very important. And in the country where Black women die 3 times more in childbirth than others, in the country where the names of Rodney King, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd still resonate in our minds. My question here is for you, Mr. Stewart. How can we explain to the youngest generations that despite all these challenges, problems, issues, that they should trust in the United States as a nation, as a space for democracy and trust?
I think that's a great question. Yeah, I think when you do consider all those different weights that are definitely placed on, this country, African Americans in America, and then really to put that pressure on young people to say you should still participate in your political process. It's extremely important. I mean, if you look at the long paths that many of our civil rights leaders, with really just the hope of passing of civil rights, just the hope of some level of equality, the hope of establishing women being able to vote, Blacks being able to vote, making some level of progress with respect to segregation. They were all built on the idea of hope. Really a strategy of just continuing to push forward and despite the different oppositions, continue to go through that push, really continue to educate. I think a lot of it really has to be drawn from education. I think a lot of times here within America, when we look at elections, we tend to focus on 4-year presidential elections, really not understanding some of the things that really frustrate you at home with your interaction with police, with your interaction with government is really local. I hear a lot of politicians say oftentimes, most politics are all local. Many of the issues that impact you are really local problems. They're not things that are always going to take place at that federal level. So young people can get involved. I mean, in America today, we have some of our youngest municipality leaders. We have some of the youngest mayors and some of the youngest city council members. You can get involved now. That change that you seek, you can truly make that change at that local level and really make an impact for your state, for your city, and also for this nation. So really helping them understand that their voice is just not a voice in which they kind of sit around in a circle and they're hearing themselves speak, but that voice can really mobilize other young people to really get out there, get active, and make an impact in their local community to really make the necessary change that they truly want to see.
Thank you
Do you
very
mind if I
much.
jump in?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I would even say too, get involved, to Mr. Stewart's point, get involved also on the policy boards. Like if you don't like the food that's being served in your community, like be part of the food policy board. Be a part of the school board if you have a child. Even if you don't have a child, you're thinking about children and you don't like the school system of how it's being set up. There are so many things I think a lot of the times people think they need to run for positions, and that's not necessarily the case if that's not your thing. You can also, have an impact on policy by being part of your local boards and parks and recs. If you want to have more of greenways, being part of the budgeting. So that way you can also understand the various, ways of how the government works, especially from the local government side. And the thing is too, you'll also be able to network with people who don't look like you as well, because a lot of the times they're thinking about how it affects them. They're not going to think about how it affects everybody else. And so in order for us to see change, you also have to remember to be a part of that change by being a part of that board as well.
Yes, exactly. I just would like to jump into the chat to interrupt our dialogue by giving the floor to one of our viewers right now. Maybe I can read for them. I'm not sure they have access to the mic, but let me just read one of the questions we have in the chat right now. By Mrs. Gabrielle Gay. she's writing on the same thread of bringing the diaspora. So she's back to the diaspora discussion into the mix when talking about Black liberation globally. How do we begin to repair these frayed relationships that exist by design via colonizers and racists? How do we buck that system, that framework that has been operating for centuries? And she says, as a Senegalese American, I hear disparaging things about it from both sides. It's a tough question. Who would like to answer this one? The gap between internal communities, the misunderstandings. Mr. Stewart.
I think, as I mentioned, like when I did live in East Africa, I think a lot of it has to do with education. I think we naturally have our own perspectives, our own assumptions of what we think about this group and that group. And I just think a lot of it really has to be education and exposure. I think we can all kind of sit around and assume and suggest this about this group. But once you actually have that time to really interact with each other and you really see the humanity in each other, we're all struggling with some of the same issues. They may look very different, but there's some of the same major issues. And I think just that conversation, to Dr. Lewis's point, a lot of times just having that sit down with food really can help really drive a lot of those problems that you have and see each other for who you are. That would be my perspective on it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Myers would like to add something here.
From a congressional standpoint, I absolutely agree with Mr. Stewart that, dispelling some of the misnomers is the number one thing. I think there should be some task force and some just smart people coming together to answer some of these questions who have influence. I think that's just one of the most honest ways to go about doing it. And to the point made earlier, it's going to take more than a comprehensive effort on behalf of not only African Americans. We have to get the buy-in from other people of color because they go through similar circumstances. And it's going to be a tough fight. I think people just need to realize that. I mean, we haven't solved it to this point in our nation's history. We don't need to be naive thinking that we can solve it tomorrow, but you have to have enough driving force. And to the point earlier, politicians have power, but they really don't have as much power as the people. When members of Congress are active is when constituents from their districts and around the country are blowing up their phones, blowing up their social media, telling them to do something, and then they actually get it done. So we really need that on the ground response, which comes to the Stewart's point about education, and really push our politicians in the right direction. One of the 10 years on Capitol Hill, to Ms. Dr. Lewis's point, there are bills that have never been passed. The Juneteenth bill was passed so quick. It was like lightning. And it just shows that when the system is working properly, things can get done. So there's a lot of red tape on our end as Congress that we also have to address from a federal level.
To continue this conversation on this topic, when I was member of the French government, people, and I mean people of my community, expected from me to continue the struggle for civil rights for them in the government, and I was hesitating. I hesitated a lot because I was wondering if I could bring that struggle into the government. How is it possible to be a patriot and in the meantime, a proud member of the African American community? How can we escape from that reproach of being anti-patriotic when we bring these topics on the table, on the public debate? What do you think about this very difficult position in which we are very often when it comes to bringing a public and political commitment on the public space? What do you think about that contradiction?
Is that for me?
Yes, you can go ahead.
I think we have
Because
to embrace it.
in the Congress, we have many people, from Karen Bass to Gregory Meeks, who hold very classic positions, but in the meantime, they continue to struggle for civil rights for their own communities. How do they manage this position?
Well, we are tough as a people. Let me start there. I think that's one of the things that people like Chairwoman Bass and Chair Fudge when she was chair, and now Chair Beatty, who runs the CBC. I think they're in such a tough position because they're working on the ground here. I've been involved with the CBC for 10 years, and I've been in those meetings. I see the way they push the speaker and all those who are in power. Again, I hate to keep, going back to the constituents, but when there is a movement, I mean, look at Black Lives Matter. Look what happened after George Floyd. That was some serious action. And it's unfortunate that it took those circumstances. But when we actually can collectively, uniformly have one voice, it is very powerful. We need more folk in the CBC to further continue that conversation. And so to the point made earlier, it's not just on a federal level. So many things are done on the local level, and all politics are local. We need folk who are in the Board of Education, not only the mayor's position, the comptroller, who's running the budgets. We need people of color in all of those positions so that they can have more of a comprehensive understanding about change policy.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lewis, a question for you. How do you appreciate the first steps of this administration? A lot was expected from them on the front of civil rights movements. What's your opinion, if I may ask you?
Well, you know what? I mean, I also worked at the State Department under the last administration. And so I can't really even, now that I'm not working for the State Department anymore, I can't really give that particular opinion, but I would definitely say that as far as, seeing any traction, even from the last administration, I did a lot of good work under that administration, kind of under the radar, and people weren't paying attention. And that was, being able to create opportunities for, in this case, it was for African women to be connected to other women and of color in STEM on the continent. I think the thing is from there is that, with this administration and what they're doing, I'm glad that, they still see that there's a need and a lot of things have to be answered. But I think is we still have to, it doesn't matter who's in power, we have to continue to keep people accountable. Right? We, like, as Lewis said, you have to sit on the boards, you have to be on the comptroller, you have to do the budgeting. As Gennaro said, you have to understand the education. So it doesn't matter who's in power, you still have to be able to kind of, I want to say, put your foot on their neck, but there's still work to be done. No administration is going to solve it in 4 years. Even if they did, is whoever, there's always going to be somebody who's not happy in the world, in the US, and they're going to try to make sure someone else comes behind it and overturns it. So the thing is like, the education part of it goes, has to happen. So for me, looking at it, especially from a Ghana perspective, something has to happen when it comes to civil rights, because you're seeing a lot of folks from the diaspora coming to Ghana. So something is not working, or people are just getting, seriously fed up. I came as not because of what was going on, but because I've always desired to live outside of the US, and it happened to be Ghana. But, people who are coming, I always explain to, like, hey, yes, there's crap going on in the US. There's also stuff going on, in the continent as well. And all these things work together, unfortunately, when it comes to the powers that be. But I would still say that those who are still in the US, there's work to be done. And, anytime I come back, which I try to come back once a year, I still vote, even though I don't live there. I still vote. I still push, younger people to be involved on, areas that I was involved in when I lived there. And we have to continue to keep pushing.
Thank you. Gennaro Stewart, you are in this administration right now. So as a senior policy advisor at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So how do you appreciate your first steps? What's your look on your own action, your own policies to this community that who voted for you, for this administration?
You have to tread lightly with this conversation as somebody who is actively, but how I will angle the conversation to answer your question. There's obviously work that needs to be done. There's continued work that needs to be done, but I can at least say I have seen a major change, particularly with this administration in the national security space. There has never been a time in which you've had so many people of color actively in this space. And I think a lot of times, I think that's extremely key from an educational standpoint and an access standpoint, that we exist. Clearly, organizations and like Atlantic Council have the representation, have the experience, and has the intellect with expertise. But I think I've never seen it ever before in which there's been this concerted effort to really go out and pull that talent, pull those experts to really be in these key positions. And I can at least say within defense and within other areas I've seen so many tremendous, extremely educated, intellectual people of color in these positions of leadership, showing that representation that we do exist. We always don't have to move into the spaces of arts and entertainment, but we really do care about the world. We really do want to make an impact in the world of international affairs and foreign affairs. And I've never seen it to this level before, in which I go to work every day and I see people who look like me, who really have the resume and the background. They've been doing this type of work for years. So I think that's a major change that we've really never seen in this country before.
Exactly. Thank you very much. When you were speaking about what you see every day in the offices, I was thinking about Europe, where work is still in progress. That's what I can say too. Far from your own outcomes, but the fight is the same. Be sure. Just another question from the chat by Julia Michaels, maybe for Dr. Lewis, because it's about her connections. She says connections can be made among Africans and diasporic peoples by way of food, like you said, Dr. Lewis. And Mrs. Michaels is asking, what about spirituality, music, and arts?
Yeah, I would definitely say there's been traction on that. I mean, now you're starting to see Afrobeats everywhere, right? It used to just be in West Africa and Nigeria, and now you see it everywhere. Even with South Africa, you're starting to hear house music everywhere. And so you're starting to see that movement as well as art. I would say here in Ghana, we have Gallery 57, and with Gallery 1957, they actually have residency programs that are for people in the diaspora. When it comes to spirituality, that can be touch and go, because you also have to think about the implications of what Christianity has done to Africans and folks in the diaspora. And so, just being very conscious of that. But you definitely see that traction. And I think we're going to see more of it, especially since, Burna Boy is everywhere, right? You're starting to see Davido everywhere, and Tiwa Savage when it comes to music. So I definitely say that there's been progress. And I think the other thing too is that a lot of the folks here, especially in the music scene, they're emulating what they see in the US. So it's not a matter of disrespect. It's really more so respect. And even in the art world, what I love seeing is that I'm so happy to see more Africans and folks in the diaspora actually, embracing creativity, because that's not, Ambassador, you may have would love to hear your experience as well, is that, when it comes to being outside of the US, being an artist is never looked up to such high standard. And now being a creative, there's so much support around that. And, you definitely are seeing that traction, but definitely more so on the ground here on the continent.
Yeah, Mrs. Michaels gives me the opportunity to stress the Atlantic Council's policy to Africa Creative Industries. At the Africa Center, we try to promote the Africa Creative Industries as a tool to better connect African diasporas, starting from here, Washington, D.C. And like you said, yes, there is in music industries, Nigerian artists such as Burna Boy, Davido, Wizkid are signing with major American labels. And Beyonce's Disney-produced musical Black is a King is a celebration of Africa, dreamed up in line with the global success of Black Panther, which featured award-winning African actors in Hollywood, such as Lupita Nyong'o and etc. And Netflix has enriched its platform of African series, TV shows, targeting African audiences. So finally, the connection is being made between the African American community and maybe beyond America and African population. So what's your opinion, Mr. Myers, about this topic, arts as a way to empower African communities, African American communities, and improve the link with the African continent?
I think that's a vehicle that is viable. I look at examples of, for instance, Jay-Z working with the NFL on their arts and entertainment. I think there's an opportunity to promote and highlight artists more on a global scale here in the United States that come from Africa. And I think, as you know, I mean, everybody has politics and you might be on one side or the other, but, you know, as we talked about earlier, music, art is one thing that can bring people together. And we need to find more remedies like that, that are more inclusive versus divisive. And so I'm always happy to entertain any opportunities where Congress can get involved with that. And there's also an opportunity too with the Library of Congress, who does a lot of history and things of that nature, which might be an opportunity to further engage that U.S. African continental relationship.
Thank you very much, Mr. Myers. From soft power to hard power, allow me to come back to Gennaro, because I see in your portfolio words like defense, Pentagon, NATO. When we speak about the U.S. foreign policy to the rest of the world, how do you envision the role of the African American community in this U.S. foreign policy? Is there a specific role they could have in the American foreign policy?
Yeah, absolutely. I can think of several friends who are at State Department currently now, who are from my state of Georgia, my city of Atlanta, who decided to really step outside of the box and really explore foreign policy. I think a lot of times we don't have that exposure. A lot of different cultures, you know, children are traveling abroad at younger ages. And I think that we need to be comfortable. And even if it's a space that, you know, you may have parents who have never traveled outside or never had a passport, I just think that exposure is extremely so important, that we should understand that there's a much bigger world out here besides the continental United States. There's a lot of relationships that you can build, and there's a lot of relatability outside the United States. That at the end, as you started off, we all originally came from the continent of Africa. So really take that walk backwards to really understand your own history and understand different paths and really get those different perspectives. It's a big world out here, via food, via art, just really educating yourself. Read books. It makes me think of like when my parents say, read books, but really get that exposure. I think when you highlighted things like Netflix, you and this device called a smartphone. I mean, you have access to the world now. Even if you're in a position in which financially you can't get there, you still have the ability to really experience these different things nowadays. That's one thing that COVID definitely taught us, that we could sit within the comforts of our own home and go on Instagram and watch verses and have an experience around the world and see artists that we probably would have never had an opportunity to really see in the same space. Just really being intentional about exposure and learning about the world.
I feel a lot of hope and optimism in this dialogue and discussion. So let's build from there. It's 11 a.m. ET from Washington, time to close our dialogue and discussion. I would like to thank you all for your critically important views on this Juneteenth, so special for the Atlantic Council community and for all the viewers we have today. I would like maybe to mention Clotilda, not only to say hello, but to thank her for all her support and help to make this event happen. So maybe Clotilda, we'd like to say a few words to close our event today.
Thank you, Ambassador Yad, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Our conversation began with expounding on the different yet united meanings of Juneteenth. One of the many themes that we discussed today was getting to a quiet, introspective space to listen and to think about how the difference in the spaces in which we occupy. Our discussion included touch points on the hills we climb as we continue to educate ourselves and others about our good and our faults in American history. Thank you to Daniel Malloy, Kiana Cunningham, Devin Johnson, Earlene Muba, Caddy Cesare, Ambassador Ramayad, Laura Macedo, Maya Edwards, Naomi Adekova, Eamon Coughlin, Jackson Styron, Graham McGilvray, Jasper Gallardi, our distinguished panelists, the members of the Black Employee Network, the Atlantic Council, and to you, our participants, and everyone who worked so hard to bring this important discussion together. Thank you and happy Juneteenth.